Okay, so like I say, today we're looking at sponsoring within the care sector and sponsor license compliance. And this really is a tailored webinar specifically for anyone who's in the care sector and is sponsoring or looking to sponsor workers. Okay, so I thought I'd just start off with a bit of kind of context of where we are at the moment, how things are for care providers. So as you may be aware, if you've been running a sponsor license, there's basically been something of a crackdown on care providers, particularly in the last sort of half year or so. There are stats that apparently there's been an 83% drop in visas issued under the health and care visa. So that's between March 2024 versus March 2023, and just a massive drop in applications. So what's happened is, well, who knows the real reason behind it all? You hear reports like this one below, these kind of dodgy care homes. So this is what this Guardian article is basically saying. It's highlighting one of these dodgy care agencies that's got a license and has basically taken the mick with it. So there's been quite a few of these kind of articles in the news. So that's been used as a sort of justification for a bit of a crackdown against care providers. I think the real reason is, the government introduced this health and care visa, which is, compared to other visas, actually quite a generous visa in the sense that you don't pay the health surcharge. It's much cheaper than it would be for other types of visas. You don't have to pay as much of a salary as in other kind of areas. And lo and behold, people have kind of cottoned onto this and been making the most of it. And basically, a very high proportion of visas over the past couple of years have been under this health and care visa. And so suddenly it's become a big issue. And now we're seeing this big crackdown taking place. Okay, so I should say I'm focusing on some of the kind of scarier stuff at the beginning. I did have two real aims with this webinar. The first one was to highlight the importance of compliance, because there are these bad things can happen if you don't get it right. But on the other hand, the other thing I want to do is actually give you some practical advice and show you that actually, if you can kind of get your head around it, it's not as complicated as it seems. And if you can get your head around it, you can actually get on top of stuff and hopefully make the most out of this system. So, but the first bit was the slightly scary stuff. So I do need to go through the reasons why we're emphasizing the importance of sponsor license compliance. So if you've not yet got a license, then if you're deemed to not be compliant, then the risk is that your application just gets refused. So I'm recognizing quite a few names here. So I think most of you probably have a license. So this would be more for people applying. The Home Office is making much greater use of remote checks. So it used to be all about having an on-site inspection where they'd physically turn up and interview the person in charge, the authorizing officer, and sponsored workers. That does still happen, but we're seeing more and more of these kind of remote checks where they are asking for evidence by email. But it's the same difference, really. It's the same information they're trying to get hold of. If you already have a license, then the big risk is of having your license revoked. So that's the ultimate sanction. If you get your license revoked, you will immediately have all your sponsored workers lose their sponsorship, and that means they have their employment immediately terminated. If you get your license revoked, there's a minimum of a 12-month, what they call quite patronizingly, a cooling off period. Like you've been a bit naughty and you have to go and just calm down a bit. So if you get a license revoked, there's a kind of extra punishment that you get this 12-month ban on reapplying. It's obviously massively disruptive to your business, especially if you're sponsoring in any kind of significant numbers. And if you get this revocation, it's really hard to challenge. So there's no right of appeal. So basically, if the Home Office make that decision, there's not an easy way to challenge that. There is something called a judicial review, but that's a measure of last resort. You take the Home Office to court. It's not a road you want to go down unless you're desperate. Okay. And it's worth flagging, I will touch on right to work a little bit more, but it's worth flagging that the penalty for employing a single person who doesn't have the right to work is now £45,000 per person. Okay, so yeah, this webinar is taken place against a backdrop of really significant changes, generally to immigration, but particularly to the care sector. So we've got the likes of the ban on dependents, which came into effect on the 11th of March 2024. So from that date forward, if you've got a new care worker coming after that date, they can't bring dependents. If someone's already on the route before that date, they can still bring dependents. But it's a really harsh and controversial new measure where the government expects people to come over and care for UK citizens, but not be allowed to bring their family. There's the change to the minimum salary, which took place on the 4th of April. Wasn't actually as great for care workers as compared to other kind of workers, various other workers, but it has gone up still to £23,211.90 per hour. There's the CQC registration requirement. So up until, I think that was also in March at some point, you could not be CQC registered, but that's now no longer possible. You have to be CQC registered to be eligible for a sponsor license. And I don't know if any of you have experienced this, but we are seeing massive delays around the processing of COS, so that's certificate of sponsorship. So we're seeing certificates of sponsorship being basically sat on by the Home Office for months for no apparent reason. We're finding generally what I would call obstructive behavior, them being a massive pain in the backside, basically asking for more information and really nitpicking every possible, finding it feels like they're trying to find any possible reason to refuse a COS request. Okay, so what's sponsor license compliance all about? I will get to the kind of nitty gritty of exactly what you need to know, because I do want this webinar to actually give you answers, not just sort of tantalize. But it's worth just having a quick look at these guiding principles behind sponsorship, because this is really, if you're wondering kind of why there is this thing called sponsor license compliance, well, you find some of the answer here. So the Home Office say sponsorship is a privilege, not a right. The sponsorship system reflects that those who benefit from migration should play their part in ensuring the system is not abused. Significant trust is placed on sponsors, and they must ensure they comply with immigration law, blah, 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 blah. And to achieve these aims, all licensed sponsors must fulfill certain duties. And then it lists the actual duties there: preventing abuse, capturing early patterns of behavior that are concerning, addressing possible weaknesses, and monitoring compliance with immigration rules. So the idea around sponsorship is that the Home Office take it very seriously and think you should take it very seriously, because you're responsible for basically what I would call keeping tabs on the person that you're sponsoring, the work that you're sponsoring. It's worth just knowing these reporting duties. So a lot of the compliance stuff relates to these reporting duties. So they require you to have systems in place so that you can meet these specific reporting duties. Okay, so you must report within 10 days if ... and I've got a list here. I'll just pick out some of the big ones. If a sponsored worker doesn't start the role for which you're sponsoring them within 28 days, or if they're absent without permission for 10 consecutive days. There's a requirement to report the worker if they're absent without pay or on reduced pay for more than 4 weeks in any calendar year. Okay. If you reduce pay, you'd have to report that within 10 days. It'd have to still be within the thresholds, but if you'd sponsored them slightly above the thresholds and then reduced, you'd have to report that. And then there's this kind of catch-all of significant changes. So a change of job role, job title, core duties, promotion. If you stop sponsoring a worker for any reason, you have to report that, and you have to report the home address. And then there's absence without permission for more than 10 consecutive days. So the Home Office, you have to know these requirements, these reporting duties, and you have to have a way of having a system that's implemented, that can implement this. Stacey's raised her hand. I don't know if that's deliberate, but Stacey, do you want to?
It's always me with the questions, sorry. You know, this sponsored work on.
Don't know if that it might have been accidental. So Stacey, if you want to say anything, let us know, but you've raised your hand.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Anyway.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. I think, Louis, I think you might.
I can't hear.
Be having issues.
Yeah. Sorry,
I can hear you, Carissa, but I can't hear anyone else.
The role for which you are sponsoring them within 28 days. So does that mean from the date that they are given a certificate of sponsorship? So when we issue their certificate of sponsorship, say if they're overseas, for example, and we issue the certificate of sponsorship, do we have to ensure then they get into the country within that 28-day period? Because we've been experienced whereby there's been delays in them coming over for reasons their end, not ours. Do we still have to report that if they don't start within that 28 days, for example? Is it 28 days from when they get over into the country, and their, the date from when their visa gets stamped?
Right. Louis, so Stacey's asking about the 28 days. So essentially, what does that 28 days entail? So from what day does that 28 days start, essentially?
Okay.
Is it,
yeah, I think I know the question. Sorry, there's some kind of technical thing where I can't actually hear. I can only hear Carissa because she's in this other end of the room, so I can hear her just through airwaves rather than through Zoom. But yeah, so it's within 28 days of the start date or the grant of the visa, whichever's the later of those dates.
And that start date.
And the grant of the visa is
including any amendments
is the stamp
to
for the 3-month entry.
Sorry, Stacey, can you just say that again?
Sorry, and the grant of the visa, that's when they come over and their passport stamped. So it's from when their passport stamped, date from the passport.
Stacey's asking if it's from the date that the passport is stamped upon entry.
Yeah, it'd be from the later of that. Hang on. So it's the later of when the visa was issued or the start date. So you can choose whichever one's more favorable. I don't think the visa stamp's a relevant date for that. It's the within 28 days of the start date on the cause, including any amendments, and or the date of issue, whichever the latest.
Does that make sense, Stacey?
Yes, so it's either the start date of the cause, so it'd have or it's the date of when you've issued the COS.
The date that it was issued on, yeah.
Okay, whichever's the latest.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
No worries.
Okay, we good to go on?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Okay, so yeah, these are the reporting duties. It's just worth bearing in mind that if you're inspected, or even if you have a remote audit, you are expected to know these specific duties. So either know them now, or at the very least, brush up before you get an inspection on these ones.
Um, sorry, I've got another quick question.
Oh, Louise,
Um,
Stacey has one more question there.
You know, it says about if they have a reduction in pay for any reason. So, if a sponsored member of staff goes off sick for a couple of days, 2 or 3 days, for example, obviously that would reduce their pay if they're getting statutory, because we've got sick pay statutory, the statutory requirement for us.
Yeah.
So if they were off for 2 or 3 days, they wouldn't be paid because they've only been off. They don't meet the criteria for getting statutory, so that therefore would reduce their hours. So we put on that they do 39 hours per week, for example. And if they were off for 3 days, then they wouldn't be working that week at all because they would be off sick and they wouldn't even have statutory requirements. So their salary would be reduced for the month. Do we have to
Right.
report any sick days like that? Because it's not very clear. I've looked at this on all the guidelines one. It just doesn't clearly outline it.
Right. Okay. So Louis, Stacey's asking about reduction in pay. So particularly to do with sick leave. So if a sponsored worker goes on sick leave, but not for enough time to be eligible for statutory sick pay, do they have to report that sick day, or basically because the salary would of course be lower that
Yeah,
month
I
or
mean,
that period?
the reporting duty is if people are absent without leave, or if they're on reduced pay for 4 weeks in total in any calendar year.
Because we've had a couple of emails
So
recently
I
from
don't know
the
if that
Home
answers. I might have to, although I was keen to take questions live as we go along, I might just have to ask people to put in the chat box actually, just because I can't. It's practically quite difficult to have Carissa.
Yeah.
Sort of,
Unfortunately, yeah, I guess just due to some technical issues, if we could just have you moving forward, just put the questions in the chat box and we'll try to get to them as best as we can at the end.
yeah. Okay, sorry about that, but I'm going to just crack on for now. So these are real life compliance questions, okay? So these actually aren't specific to a care home. So there would likely be a few slightly different ones, but these are the same ones that always come up, okay? Whether that's on-site inspection or remote check. So how will you conduct a right to work check? I am going to come back and focus on these, but I'm just going to run through them a bit more quickly now. How do you store passports, biometric permit, visa copies? How do you monitor visa expiry dates? Which contact details do you keep, do you keep for your employees? How often do you check that contact details for your employees are correct and up to date? How do you record previous contact details for your employees? How do you intend to inform us if there are any significant changes in sponsor migrant circumstances, and within what time frame? So for that, number 7 is the previous slide. 10 days, and then it's those various triggers that you have to report. And I was going to say obviously, but maybe not, you must report it through the sponsor management system. Yeah, so whenever you're making a report, it's through the sponsor management system, which if you don't have a license is the web portal that you get access to when you get a license. They'll ask about how you record absence history for your employees. And then the more of an employment law one, which is what conditions a sponsored migrant would be entitled to, such as holidays, sick pay, accommodation allowances. So you can be fairly certain that something like this will come up if you're inspected. And I'm going to zoom in on a few of these. Okay, so this is probably the most sort of meaty section of what I call the key areas of compliance. Up until you got a sponsor license, right to work checks were basically optional. Okay, so you could take the chance and not do a right to work check. If the person turned out to be an illegal worker, well, you'd have a risk of I think it used to be 20,000, it's now £45,000 fine, but it was still your risk to take. Now, with a sponsor license, it's not optional, so it's just a mandatory thing that you have to be doing right to work checks. So I've got some of the potential consequences for non-compliance. This always makes people a bit alarmed. We've got the 45,000 fine, which is actually a separate issue from a loss of a license. That should be on a separate line, because having the civil penalty notice can lead to, I think if it's 2, it's a mandatory loss of license. 1 is a maybe you lose your license situation. It's worth knowing that if you knowingly employ someone who doesn't have a right to work, that's a criminal offence and can be a 5-year prison sentence. I've got it again here, loss of license. Okay, so if you do a proper right to work check, you get something called a statutory excuse. So it's like a defence against civil prosecution. And there's 2 types of statutory excuse. There's a permanent statutory excuse, or there's a temporary statutory excuse. If you do a right to work check on someone who's British, has indefinite leave to remain, or settled status, that will give you something called a permanent statutory excuse. And that basically means you're covered indefinitely forever until that person leaves. But if someone's on any other kind of time-limited permission to stay, time-limited visa, including a skilled worker sponsored visa, you're only covered for the duration of their visa. Okay, so if someone presents you with a 2-year visa, you do a right to work check. You've then got a temporary statutory excuse just until that person's visa expires, and you have to do a follow-up right to work check in this example, 2 years' time. There are different ways of doing a right to work check. And there is actually this right to work checklist, which will tell you the kind of documents that you need. But basically, if a person's British, you need their British passport. And you have to do a physical check of the passport, have it in your hand, check it looks consistent, information's consistent, photos, likeness, etc. It's worth knowing that, so you have to do a right to work check on everyone. You can't say, oh, this guy's British, we don't have to do a right to work check on him. You have to do a right to work check on anyone. It's not for you to be deciding who's British or who's not. For anyone that is British or has one of these old indefinite leave to remain stamps in their passport, you would take a photo of that, a photocopy of that. But you have to record when the right to work check was taken. So you could have a stamp, or just write on top of the photocopy, say, I confirm a right to work check was done by Louis McWilliam on 23rd of May, whatever it is, 2024. Okay, so that's what I call the traditional method. But there is an online right to work check for anyone who's on a time-limited visa. And for that, you'll need a share code, and you have to carry out an online right to work check. So you get the share code from the worker or from the individual, enter that onto a certain website, enter the date of birth, and it'll confirm that person's status. So you have to be doing an online right to work check for these people. You can't copy the biometric residence permit. That's no longer a valid right to work check. And just make sure you're doing the right to work check before the worker starts employment. If you do it after they start work, it's not a valid right to work check. And just remember that you will need to do a follow-up right to work check if the person's on a time-limited visa. So the right to work things can get, I mean, this is the kind of basics, is probably enough for most people. I have done webinars on this whole area. So there's a bit more to go into, but this is hopefully enough for you to get an idea of the key things to know. Okay, one of the other key areas of compliance is leading on from right to work checks, is just making sure you're diarising visa reminders. It sounds like a small thing, but the Home Office are absolutely obsessed about this. So just make sure you are diarising whenever someone's visa expires. And we suggest you have 2 dates. You've got the actual date of the visa expiry, and then we would recommend that you are setting a reminder for 3 months before that date. So say if someone's visa expires on like the 1st of July 2024, you'd want a visa reminder on the 1st of April 2024 to say Joe Bloggs' visa expires in 3 months' time. And that should be enough to tick that tick that box. You might optionally have a spreadsheet to manage visa expiry dates, but I would say it's really that diarising systems that's key. A lot of this might seem a bit odd, but it's kind of like a game you've got to play, really. You've just got to be seen to be on top of stuff. Okay. Ailsa says, can you do right to work checks on existing UK employees? Yeah, I mean, you must do right to work checks on UK employees. So you meant to do, I mean, if you've employed people before you got a license, there was no duty to do right to work checks on them. So I don't think it's a problem if, say, you got your license 2 years ago, and you've got people that came 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 20 years who joined prior. If you'd not done a right to work check on that, you can't be sort of retrospectively punished. It's more that you have to be doing right to work checks on anyone who starts once you have a license. Okay. And I would say that if you haven't done right to work checks since you've had a license, I do think it's worth, even though they're not technically valid right to work checks, I do think it's worth just going and getting evidence of a right to work check. So carrying out a right to work check, even though it's not technically a proper right to work check, it's better to do that retrospectively than to do nothing. Okay, Melvin's, I think I might have to deal with some of these questions as I go along, otherwise there'll be a load at the end that aren't really, that aren't relevant to the slide that we're going through at the time. So Melvin says, you mentioned visa applications in March 2024 just considerably down versus 2023, and later mentioned the Home Office inexplicably delaying the issue of cause for months. This is what many of my clients experienced. My understanding that these two observations are directly related and it isn't actually down to demand. Yes, very true. So, in fact, I was speaking to we had a slide at the beginning showing that we're a member of the National Care Association, and I was chatting to their chief executive, and he'd been in a meeting with some Home Office kind of civil servant-y people, and they said they've had explicit instructions to get the numbers down by whatever means. So basically, I think it's right that it's the Home Office making life very difficult for care providers that's just putting people off, leading people to give up. I don't think it's a demand thing. I don't think it's demand so much from the workers. There may be a little bit because you can't bring dependents, but I do think it's just making life very difficult for care providers. There's a big one there. Ilse, can you use DBS documentation? Not for a right to work check, but you can use passports, and in certain circumstances you can use a birth certificate in conjunction with, I think, an NI number. Okay, I'm gonna crack on for now. Okay, so another one of the big ones is updating contact details. Again, it sounds like a really simple thing, but the Home Office expect you to have a record of past and current contact details for all sponsored migrants. That includes residential address, personal email address, telephone number. And the requirement is that this is, quote, that this must always be kept up to date. Okay, so again, there's quite an easy fix on this. You have to, I would recommend that you diarise at least every 6 months to check your sponsored workers' contact details, address, email, telephone number, etc. That way you can be seen to be keeping it always up to date. And you've just got to be careful that you don't overwrite previous addresses. So a lot of these kind of HR tools that you get do allow you to keep the address or contact details of your employees, but they'll overwrite the previous details. The idea is that if one of your sponsored workers goes AWOL, as as per the previous slide, you have to report them to the Home Office in certain situations, and you can then present them with a record of current address and previous addresses. It seems a bit odd to me why you would need old addresses, like they're going to go back to an old house to escape. But again, it's kind of part of this game to be played. Okay, this is a bit of a cheat, this one, because I've put it as one slide, but it's actually lots of, well, quite a few sort of discrete, smaller things, if you like. So other areas of compliance, you've got to be careful. Well, minimum salary thresholds, so I already talked about them, but if you're not paying the appropriate minimum salary, that's a big problem. One other thing that's we've seen people getting picked up on quite a lot is consistency around hours and contracts. So we've had a lot of stuff where you've put forward to the Home Office that you're sponsoring a care worker on X hours, okay, X number of hours a week. They've then requested more information, and you've provided a contract that's got a different number of hours by one, okay? They are really picking up on stuff like this. So just make sure that you're consistent across your contracts and all the evidence you're putting forward, that it's consistent, okay? So there's this issue of registration with CQC. I've talked about that. They do want to know that you're generally complying with employment law. Now, I'm not going to go into this now because employment law is this massive area in itself, okay? But stuff like holiday pay has to be correct, and making sure people are getting the statutory holidays, etc. Genuine vacancy is another one. So there is a requirement that any vacancy is what they call genuine. And this really gives the Home Office a lot of discretion to look into stuff that they kind of feel that doesn't quite feel right. You might be ticking the right boxes, but they're not happy about something. So they'll use this kind of genuineness test. It's worth always keeping a record of your attempts to recruit from the UK market. Okay, so just keep a record of stuff like adverts you've been placing in various places. There used to be this really cumbersome test called the resident labour market test. That doesn't exist anymore, but it's still wise just to be able to show, if asked, that you've been struggling domestically, which I'm sure many of you, it's kind of self-evident there's a crisis in care recruitment, but you still sometimes need to evidence it. Right, so appointing level 1 users, the Home Office do recommend that you have at least 2 level 1 users. When you first get your license, you can only nominate 1 level user, but the Home Office recommend in quite a few places you have a second one. And the issue there is in case your level 1 user's absent, on leave, sick or whatever, they expect you to have someone else who can slot in and take over. Another slightly random point is log into your sponsor management system at least once a month. So they do monitor, they have monitored how often you're logging into your sponsor management system. If you're highly active in sponsorship, you're probably doing that naturally anyway, but you might not be. We did have, I think it was about a year ago or a bit longer, loads of people got emailed by the Home Office saying, we've noticed you've not logged into your sponsor management system for a while. And there was a kind of loose threat. It wasn't really clear what they were going to do about it, but there was a bit of a wagging of the finger. So yeah, it's worth just bearing that in mind and maybe diarising to check in. And again, I've touched on this, so I won't go through it again, but understanding those reporting obligations that I went through before when you need to report a worker to the Home Office. Okay, I'm coming towards the end. We'll have time to answer some questions in a bit. I just had some sort of final thoughts here. So I always say to my clients, think about students and whether they're suitable for roles. So it's just more of a, this is just a kind of my tip really. It's not and it's partly immigration, it's partly kind of business sense. So there are benefits to sponsoring students. They exempt you from the immigration skills charge, which is 364 per year, or £1,000 if you're a medium or large business. And you can also kind of try before you buy. You can have them work for you under their student visa, see how they are. So something to consider. They'll also be good at English and have passed the English language requirement. But if you are wanting to take on a student, just bear in mind a recent rule change that said the students have to have completed their course before they can switch. So yeah, big news. Elections on the 4th of July. Just announced yesterday there's going to be a general election on the 4th of July. Looks kind of like Labour are going to get in power. So it'll be interesting to see what impact that has on immigration generally and the care sectors. So I think there's a lot of people hoping that any new government will be a bit less radical, a bit less crazy. Yeah, I hoped by getting across some of the key areas of sponsor license compliance, I've kind of demystified some of it. It can seem really confusing. There's a huge amount of guidance, but really if you can just zoom in on these kind of key areas of compliance that I've been talking about today, then you should be able to get on top of stuff. And if you can just put in that time to try and get on top of sponsor license compliance, I think it is still a great area to get into, because you do get a lot of workers from overseas who can be incredibly committed. Obviously, there's big recruiter fees if you're recruiting from within the UK anyway. So while sponsor license compliance can seem like a really large, kind of overwhelming area, it's worth just trying to get your head around it all, and then you can really make the most of sponsorship. Okay, so just in terms of how Truth Legal can help, we've got different kinds of support we can provide. We can do something called a mock audit, where we can pretend to be the Home Office and really go through your HR systems and identify any kind of areas of weakness and suggest areas that you can change to be compliant. We have all kind of consultations. So we have different kind of arrangements with different clients. Some are just kind of touching base for more kind of complex matters. We have consultations, or we can have the more kind of formal mock audit. But all that should help you stay on top of your compliance. We've got loads of free information on our website. In all our guides and blogs, we try to kind of give away the information so that you can do it yourself. Obviously, if you want to come to us and pay us to help you, that's great. But on the other hand, we try to get as much information as possible on our website and through webinars like this, so that you can try and tackle any issues yourself. I've got some resources here. I meant to say at the beginning, there are these at least 3 guides that are really you're supposed to read. One's on part 3, sponsor license duties and compliance. One specifically for skilled worker, and one around record keeping. So we'll have links to these all these documents available. And I think that about finishes everything I was going to say. So yeah, I'm sorry there's been a problem with audio, but I think Chris is going to say something.
Oh yeah, I was just going to mention, we'll also be sending around slides from the webinar and the recording of the webinar. You'll get that should get that by the end of the day tomorrow.
Okay.
Sorry, I think I missed
Stacey.
something. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think I missed something. I think you did cover somebody's question about asking about hours. Say if we put down on the COS that they're doing 39 hours, for example, can their staff members do 36 hours one week, 44 another, and mix it all up as long as it meets the criteria at the end of the 4 or 5 weeks?
Right. Okay. Louis, so Stacey's asking about discrepancy in hours of work. So I know someone else, I'm just finding
Yeah,
it in the
someone
chat
else has
there.
asked the same question. They've
Yeah,
said they're down.
Afsha asked
Yeah.
if staffs are recorded to work 37.5 hours a week, can staff do 36 hours 1 week and 44 hours 1 week? So can there be a difference in hours per week as long as it?
If it's sort of varying, so is the point that there's different hours each week?
Yes.
If that's the point, you're supposed to, when you assign the cause, you're meant to say what the variation in hours is. I mean, ultimately, they will look at the average. So as long as say if it's 37.5 hours, but it's more 1 week less than next, as long as you're averaging the correct amount. But it would be advisable if there's a different work pattern to put that on the cause when you assign the cause. And if it's a permanent change in hours, to report that through the portal. I don't know if that's answered the question.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good.
So it's best not to do it really.
I was just going to quickly go through.
Sorry, what was that, Stacey?
It's best not to do it really. Well, not to do it often anyway.
Louis, would you say it's best to not do it often or not to do it?
Sorry, can you say that again?
Would you say it's best to not have a difference in hours?
Best to not put hours.
Sorry, but is it best to not have a difference in hours each week? Hours worked.
Sorry, I can't quite hear you.
Is it best to are you hearing me through the mic or are you
No, I'm just hearing you.
Okay,
No,
all right.
not through the mic.
Is it best to have just the same standard hours per week for each employee?
Well, you can, yeah. I mean, I guess it's simplest just to have the same hours each week, but you can have a different work pattern, but you have to explain it when you assign the cause. So you could say, for example, individual will work 20 hours or 30 hours 1 week, 50 hours the next week. You just have to explain that work pattern.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Sarah says we can't access additional cause due to the DPS framework we're on with the local council. I'm afraid I don't know what that means. So I'm not sure what the DPS framework is.
I would be able to speak. Do you know the issue that we confirmed, Louis, last week when we had a call? It's the same.
Louis, it's the same issue you had last week in a call?
Sorry?
Stacey's saying it's the same issue you had last week in a call.
Okay, I mean, I can follow that up with Stacey maybe separately. It might be an idea.
I think Sarah's asking about it or mentioning it in the chat.
Yeah, I'm happy to discuss that, but obviously Louis can't hear me, so
Yeah.
that's the difficulty.
It's the same issue we have.
Louis, do you want to try turning your headset off and just see if you can just hear
Yeah.
everyone out? And yeah.
Okay.
I mean, if Stacey's gone through it the other week,
Yeah,
maybe.
Louis recommended for us to contact the local authorities to
someone
get
say something?
more evidence from them about it. So
Oh,
we've requested
Can you
letters
hear
from
me
them
okay
to
through
go into more
this
detail
microphone?
about the framework and what the expectations are.
Yeah.
And did that work for you, Stacey?
Well, I'm
Right.
hoping it
So
will.
yeah, there's loads of questions here. I don't know. It's quite difficult to get through these. How frequent are inspections? Is it dependent on your size? The Home Office used to say they intend to inspect everyone at some point in the duration of the license. That doesn't happen in practice. It seems to be largely intelligence led. So if there's any kind of like issue with CQC, illegal working, but they're also looking at stuff like, do you have a website? How many people are you sponsoring? So the more people you sponsor, the higher the chance that you will be inspected. So there's no bright line. I can't say that it's a X percentage or X number, but there seems to be a general principle that the more you sponsor, the more likely you are to be audited. But that said, if you can get on top of sponsor license compliance side of stuff, there's kind of nothing to fear because they're going to go through those kind of questions that we've looked at before. So if you can just stay on the right side of that, then that should be fine. Stacey says she would really recommend the mock audit. Thank you very much, Stacey. Didn't pay you
Louis,
to say
just
that.
going up to near the top, going back to one of Stacey's questions, there was a question about statutory sick pay and reporting duties with staff being off on sick leave. It's about 2:30
All right,
time.
so if it's a reduction in pay due to statutory sick pay, I think there's an exception to the reporting requirement for that. Okay, so I think there's an exception if it's statutory sick pay to the normal requirement. I'd want to double check that.
Yeah, it's because
I think that's an
recently we've
exception.
had a
I
couple
have
of
to check
emails.
that, Stacey, again, look into that.
We just had, the reason why I'm asking the question is because we had a couple of emails from the Home Office to say that the members of staff weren't meeting the threshold.
Sorry, Louis. Stacey's just elaborating on that. She said that they've received some correspondence from the Home Office saying that the staff didn't meet the threshold.
But it's because they were off sick for a number of days.
But because they were off sick, that's why they didn't meet the threshold. Stacey, maybe it might be a good idea to get in touch with us after the webinar, if that's okay, and
Okay, yeah, that's
we'll help
fine.
you sort that out. Okay, thank
Oh,
you.
brilliant.
Yeah, so I'm happy to have a call later on, or yeah, and we'll go through that. It sounds a bit complicated, something I need to look into.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think I might wrap it up there. Sorry again about the technical difficulties. I hope that you've had some useful information there. And yeah, I appreciate you all taking the time to join. And please do join us on the next one, which is, I think it's an employment one. Is it, Carissa?
Yes, it is. Yes, it's on the 20th of June, and it's 5 documents all employers should have. And that's with Navia Shekhar, one of our, the head of employment, and another director at Truth Legal. And like I said, I will be sending out an email following up with the slides from the webinar and a recording of the webinar. And I'll also feel free to get in touch with us with any other questions you may have, and we'll do our best to help you out. All right.
Okay, I'll leave it
Thanks,
there for now.
everybody.
Thanks again for joining.